Marek, I want to ask you, I mean, the obvious thing. In fact, it was you when just popped over to your office for a friendly visit before Christmas, and you said that definitely Russia would invade Ukraine. And that was the first time I heard someone say it would definitely happen. I went home and told my family, and they were saying, no, no, no. And so you were the first person I heard it from. It's a very hard question to answer, but if you can give us your sort of overview on how the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is impacting business, will impact business, and what you can comment on this.
Well, a huge package of questions, and I think the first thing to start off with, the reason why I felt bold enough to say that is because ultimately, for many years, Western policy has been based on towards Russia has been based on a misreading of both the mentality and the psychology of Putin, and also to some extent a misreading of the nature of the Russian national identity, the Russian soul, if you like. 30 years ago, when the Berlin Wall came down, it seemed as though the whole of Europe, including Russia, was on a path towards a grand, what we might call a grand future of liberal stability, where over time the values of democracy, rule of law, democratic freedoms would gravitate not just to Central Europe, which moved very quickly into the Western orbit, initially through membership of NATO, so in the case of Poland, Czechia, and Hungary, and then of the European Union, of those countries, and that has expanded in over the last 20 years as well. But it was also hoped or expected that these values of stability would roll over into Russia itself. And the one thing, and that was in retrospect a misinterpretation of what was likely to happen because of fundamental misreading of the degree of first of all social attitude, how embedded social attitudes of authoritarianism were embedded within the Russian mentality, and it's a historic. I won't go into the historical, sociological aspects of it, but there is basically the cultural backdrop within Russia is heavily slated against a liberal democratic order. And secondly, it was also a misinterpretation of the evolution of Russian elites post-Yeltsin, and a misinterpretation of Putin, who, in the eyes of many people, was accepted as having, his KGB background and so on, but he was seen as being ultimately, albeit a ruthless but a rational player. And what's been clear over the last decade, if not the last 15 years, as Russian policy has evolved, driven largely by Putin, is actually motivated by ideology, which is very difficult for us to accept in the West, because we all felt that ideology finished not just with the collapse of Nazi Germany, but the collapse of Soviet communism. But ideology plays a very strong role in Putin's mindset, and his sense of historical mission of being in the position that he is in order to fulfill the destiny of Russia, of recovering lost lands, of reuniting the Russian-speaking peoples within this broader Eurasian landmass. I think all that was underestimated, and how much of a driver it is of his policy. Now, so that is the broader background, because of to understand where we are today in terms of what motivated Putin to invade Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to bore you, and I'm sure you read everything that we read in the papers about how he misinterpreted not just the degree of resistance that he would find in Ukraine, or the determination of the Ukrainian leadership, or his complete misunderstanding or lack of intelligence or information on the parlous state of his armed forces, all of which has led to where we are today, which is a quagmire, which is very difficult to see how he can withdraw from with any sense of victory. And in fact, the prospect is, and especially as we see more and more Western arms being channeled into Ukraine through Poland, of an increasingly effective character, because it started off as quite sort of piecemeal military assistance, but the last couple of weeks have shown that there's much more heavy equipment being rolled into Ukraine, which will support possibly a very long war of attrition within Ukraine, where neither Russia has the strength to actually effect a total defeat on Ukraine, and Ukraine, despite all this help, still does not really have the very effective weaponry that you would normally require for a massive military success, such as aircraft or anti-aircraft defenses. So all of this means that we're in this for the long haul, and the impact that that will have on not just short-term economics, but the long-term relationship between Europe and Russia is very, very fundamental. And hopefully in the next few minutes we can go into that in more detail.
So again, big question, but what does this mean for Poland geostrategically?
Well, the short-term answer is that obviously it's a very nervous time for Poland. Poland is literally in the front line. It has... Over the years, it was always regarded itself as being in the front line against Russia. It was one of the few countries in the European Union and in NATO that actually gauged correctly what the danger of Russia towards Ukraine was and what the effects of a Ukrainian defeat would be for Poland. So Poland's been very engaged in supporting Ukrainian independence for many years. And obviously this is a period where Poland is literally in the front line because, as you know, not just through its own efforts, and we saw over the last couple of days the news that Poland has been supplying T-72 tanks to Ukraine, supported, backfilled, as it were, by the UK government with Challenger tanks, but also becoming a major logistics, well, in fact, the major logistics hub for all of NATO near Rzeszów, in Rzeszów and in that area towards Przemyśl, where both troops and equipment and material and all sorts of weapons are being, as it were, stored and then on the covert means being transferred into the Ukraine. So Poland is really has moved back into a sort of pole position, I like to use that pun, within NATO. So it's a very nervous time for Poland. But in the long term, well, so let me rephrase that. In the medium term, this will actually elevate Poland into a very, very important position in two fundamental ways, or three perhaps. One is in its relationship with the United States, and this is actually a very, very important point. Over the last couple of years, certainly since the end of the Trump administration and under the initial period of the Biden administration, Poland was out of favor with the United States. It had seen as aligned itself too much with Trump. There was no real dialogue between either President Biden and President Duda. There was very little intergovernmental relationships going on. And really, and the background of all that was also controversies over the rule of law, media freedom, the attempt by the government to subvert the position of the TVN television station. All of this was causing a lot of friction on the Polish-American axis. The effect of Poland stepping up, as it were, to the Ukraine crisis, and also, by the way, investing substantially in defense equipment from the United States. As you've been following over the last few months, there have been a number of announcements about additional procurements of US military equipment by Poland, whether it's tanks or it's more missiles and various other air defense systems. This has made that Poland is now being seen by the United States administration, particularly the State Department, the Defense Department, as being an absolute key ally. And the areas where the US had seen Poland as being as backsliding are now off the United States governmental agenda. It's still there, much less, and it's basically the US government is saying, well, we'll let the European Union look after all these difficult things. We're now building up the bilateral relationship, and you've seen, or the President Biden was here last month, or was it earlier this month? President Duda in Washington, Minister Błaszczak in Washington, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin in Warsaw. All of this is very, very important. So it's put Poland back into the frame in the United States. And I think that's excited a lot of US investors. A lot of US investors who had slightly gone a bit cool on Poland because they've been hearing all this stuff about rule of law and maybe it's a populist government and what's going on. Now there's a lot more sense that the US government itself, both diplomatically, militarily, is literally investing in Poland, and that's giving a lot more sense of stability here. So the second area where Poland is now, where this is, so that's good for, I think, the general perspective of American business looking at Poland. We now have a very effective ambassador of the United States here, we have a very effective ambassador, by the way, of Poland in the United States, Marek Matraszek, previously ambassador to Israel, is a big hit in Washington. He's very articulate. He's doing a lot of good work to promote Poland within the US diplomatic and investor community. So Poland is back as far as the US is concerned. Secondly, I think the area which is also significant business-wise is the increased impact that Poland is now making on both the short-term response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine through promoting a very hard line on sanctions. And this is actually very important because, as you know, the Polish government has been not just generally supportive of the EU position on sanctions, but also saying we need to go a lot further. And what Poland has been focusing on is, and it's lobbying very heavily within Brussels, is, what are we doing about our dependency on Russian hydrocarbons? There's Poland, particularly Europe, speaking to Europe, what are you doing about stopping importing coal, gas, and oil from Russia? Because bear in mind, in the sanctions regime, the payments for hydrocarbons from Russia into Europe are almost the only remaining hard currency source of revenue for Russia globally. It's about 700 or 800 million euro a day goes to Russia through these energy exports. And Poland is taking a lead position in saying to Europe, we need to wean ourselves off this very, very quickly. By quickly, I mean like now, and certainly by the end of the year, to sort of turn the tap off from that. And you will be aware that Poland has already banned the import of Russian coal. Paradoxically, President Putin has actually done a lot of the dirty work for Poland in the sense he's cut off the gas import tap into Poland 2 days ago, and I'll come on to why that's maybe not as significant as Russia thinks. So, but what does all this mean? It means that Poland is going to be taking a very strong position in Europe on the issues of the green agenda, and it's going to be pushing very hard on a more rapid diversification of energy sources for industry. It's going to be looking at things like nuclear energy and saying to Europe, you really need to turn nuclear on and Russian hydrocarbons off. And that's going to impact the speed and pace at which the European Union as a whole moves into green energy, diversified energy, and also diversified sources of gas coming into Europe. Whether it's from the Middle East or whether it's from LNG coming in from the United States. I would not be surprised also if you see a revival of the debate on fracking inside the European Union, because obviously that's a great untapped source of gas. So Poland is now also, because of its position on energy, is now much more of a voice in Brussels. And the other thing that's happened now, and this is getting to the nuances of Polish politics, there's been a shift in the ruling party inside Law and Justice, which for a long time was playing the Eurosceptic card. And it was doing so partly because of short-term political interest, but also quite an ideologically driven faction within the ruling coalition led by the current Justice Minister, Mr. Ziobro, who for a long time has sought to build up his internal political position on playing a very hard-line Eurosceptic card, whether it's on EU energy policy, rule of law issues. And all of this was tolerated or even encouraged by Jarosław Kaczynski and the leadership of the Law and Justice Party as a way of building up their domestic electoral base and also extracting one or two concessions from the European Union. In the face of this new political order where we have the West versus Russia, Kaczynski and the leadership of the Law and Justice Party have realized that ultimately this is not a very clever thing to be doing. This is not the time for any discussions of Polexit. This is not a time to be burning bridges with Brussels. And together with President Duda, who has actually played an increasingly important role in smoothing relations with Brussels, Poland is very close to okay, albeit a soggy compromise with Brussels over rule of law issues. It's very finely balanced, but there is a chance that within the next few weeks, Poland will have made enough progress on these issues to allow the European Union to turn the tap back on in terms of COVID relief funding, as well as the longer-term financial perspective, where again there was the threat of a linkage of funding to Poland if rule of law issues were not sorted out. I'm much more optimistic now that that's going to disappear. Brussels, I think, rather cynically, has decided to take advantage of Poland's new pragmatism towards Brussels and wean Poland off this rather toxic relationship that had developed between Poland and Hungary. And because of the rule of law issues are much more severe in Hungary than they are in Poland. Media issues are much more severe in Hungary than they are in Poland. And I think Hungary has, and Brussels has now basically decided to target its ire on Hungary as opposed to Poland. And Poland, actually, despite its love-in with Orban over the many years and the strong relationship with Kaczynski and Orban, are actually much more relaxed about that than they were previously, primarily because they fundamentally disagree with Orban's policy on Russia and sanctions and energy issues with Russia. So all of this is laying the ground, I think, for a much more stable Poland in the eyes of Brussels. It's going to as it were, re-pragmatize, if I can use that phrase, Poland's relationship within the European Union. And the third area where this whole crisis has put Poland, and I think this is perhaps an interesting point to as we look into the future, is put Poland in a prime position. Poland's very vigorous position on Ukraine has put it in a prime position to do two things. First of all, become a much more of a regional leader. And I think we've seen Mr. Morawiecki and the political leadership here doing a lot to marshal, as it were, the relationship with the Baltic states, to reinvigorate the relationship with the Czech Republic, with Slovenia, with Slovakia. Romania as well, by the way, is very significant for Poland because there is a strong bilateral Polish-Romania relationship. And I think if the crisis over Transnistria and Moldova flourishes over the next few weeks, you're going to see that becoming more and more Poland as well. So Poland is becoming, and the smaller countries in the region, the Baltics and the various sort of countries in the region are now looking to Poland for leadership. So that's put Poland. So that's the three things: a reinvigorated relationship with the United States, a re-pragmatized relationship with Brussels, and a revived position as a regional leader. And looking into the future, all this means is that taken together with Poland's incredibly vigorous support for Ukraine, we've seen the Prime Minister go there, we've seen Mr. Kaczynski go there. The Ukrainians certainly perceive Poland as being their champion within both the European Union and within NATO. And, let's pray, let's hope that the war will go well for Ukraine. But when we do come into the reconstruction phase, this will be a big opportunity for Poland, be a big opportunity for Polish business within Poland to take advantage of all the opportunities that are going to rise up, not just in terms of the short-term reconstruction contracts, which doubtless there will be numerous of those being bandied about by the government in Kiev, and Poland will be granted, I suspect, substantial portions of those contracts, but also longer terms in terms of the trade relationship and the pace within which the European Union will be moving towards accepting Ukraine as some form of member, maybe not full membership, but Poland will be pushing very hard for that. And that's also good for Polish business because that obviously is going to mean more trade and more business. So overall, in a space of literally 3 months, Poland has now been transformed into the poster child in Washington, in Brussels, and in the region. And that's a tremendous asset for Poland, which I'm sure they will try to sort of monetize as they go forward.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you summed it up pretty comprehensively, but we have time for one question, quick question and a quick answer, if we can.
You knew it was going to be me, right, Richard? Mark, that's probably the best assessment I've heard from a pundit in quite some time. Thank you.
Oh, that's kind of
the
you.
situation. Much appreciated. Two countries with which Poland has reasonably close relationships economically and politically, I'd say. Turkey and Israel, relative sideliners in this last 2 months. How do you foresee the relationships going forward and coming back to, obviously, impacts on Poland?
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. Israel, what a topic. A very fractious relationship for all sorts of reasons, as you know. Under Netanyahu, Poland, by the way, is one of the most pro-Israel countries in Europe. And consistently, regardless of what government's been in position since 1990, Poland has been one of the most pro-Israel countries. Have been very supportive of the Israeli position on Palestine within the United Nations. They've been very supportive on all the issues that are controversial. And they've been, all Polish governments have historically made tremendous efforts to rebuild the sort of the cultural and relationship and the historical memory issues. You have the Polish Museum here. There's no question that fundamentally there's a very strong desire by Poland to have an excellent relationship with Israel and the global Jewish community. What we've seen, unfortunately, over the last couple of years is a fracturing of that relationship, primarily driven by the change in government in Israel, where the Bennett-Lippad alliance, unfortunately, has taken on a very sort of aggressive position towards Poland for a lot of complicated issues involving property restitution, historical memory issues, and so on, but are going over the top. And we've seen a decline in the bilateral relationship to the point where, for a time last year, there were no ambassadors. I mentioned Mr. Magierowski in Washington. He was literally kicked out of Israel as the Polish ambassador to Tel Aviv. And so there is a fundamental problem there, which is not yet resolved, and it's been compounded by the perception by not just Poland but many other countries that Israel, quote, has not come to the party on Ukraine. Israel has a very complex relationship with Russia, and the fact that the Israeli government has actually prevented some weapons transfers to Ukraine has not gone down at all well, and it's further damaged Israeli interests, particularly in the defense sector in Poland. Unfortunately, the relationship is now so bad, paradoxically, there are now efforts being made to revive it at the presidential level. We'll see how far that goes. So, unfortunately, Israel, the bilateral Polish-Israel relationship was not good in the last couple of years. It's got worse, and hopefully, we will see that reversed in due course, as it has to be. On Turkey, again, a very interesting question. Poland is actually very keen on Turkey, all sorts of reasons. One driver is actually the Turkish position on Ukraine. Despite the strong personal relationship between Erdogan and Putin, there's been a lot of activity in support of Ukraine, defense sales, and Poland has invested a lot in the bilateral relationship. Both President Duda and the Defense Minister Błaszczak were in Ankara over the last couple of months signing up new defense deals. And, there is a long historical relationship with Turkey, going back literally hundreds of years. I mean, not many people know that after the partitions, the Ottoman Empire is one of the few countries that could refuse to recognize the partition of Poland after 1795. Anyway, historical details. So there is a great deal of sympathy with Ankara, and I think that's that's another area where I think Poland is actually, in the lead in terms of working very hard to keep Turkey as an active member within NATO, and obviously working also in the very long term to bring Turkey into a close relationship with the EU. So from a Turkish perspective, Poland is a very important country in Europe.
I don't know if this is too big a question to just brush on. In terms of renewable energy, what are the main things that people who are not in the energy industry, but obviously affects all of us, what are the main things that we should look out for in the next couple of years in terms of renewable energy legislation or important factors?
Well, I think, again, this is where Poland is much more pragmatic than people give it credit for. There is a myth of Poland being totally in hock to the coal lobby domestically, but Poland recognizes that over time it has to move into a much more pragmatic arrangement with European legislation on energy, and in fact, where possible, Poland is now moving forward on whether it's promoting solar, whether it's promoting wind. There was a great deal of resistance to both offshore and onshore wind farms. There's legislation moving through that's going to smooth that part of the story, and also on nuclear. Poland is, again, really in the lead in Europe, not because it particularly loves nuclear energy, but because it sees this as a crucial way of getting away, not just away from dependency on Russia, but also transitioning away from coal domestically. And Poland is actually, the Polish-French relationship is again fractious for all sorts of reasons. But one of the areas where there is a lot of commonality is a very strong Polish-French alignment on the interests of nuclear power and of building that into the sort of green taxonomy together with other countries in the region. So from Poland's perspective, it's not a question of if or whether, it's a question of timing and tempo. And I think Poland over the next 10, 15 years is going to be moving quite solidly into the renewables area. And that's going to obviously also impact, the building industry, construction industry, because obviously the various regulations around energy usage, green buildings, that's going to come in. And Poland will not be, I think, as resistant as many people think to that happening.
Okay, well, thank you, Marek. Obviously, huge topics, very much just an overview, but thank you very much for talking to us.
Pleasure to be here, Richard. Thank you very much.